Here at the Inside Scoop, the hormone that I probably talk about the most is the stress hormone cortisol. I talk about it in relationship to training stress, life stress, its impacts on blood glucose, metabolism, immunity, etc. So I thought it would be a good idea to review a little bit about what it is, what it does, and then use that as a jumping off point to review a new publication that talks about a few really simple ways to make sure that we're not excessively producing cortisol. Because to be clear, this is one of those Goldilocks hormones where we don't want too little, we don't want too much, we want it to be just right. One of the most defining characteristics of cortisol is its very profound circadian rhythm, which basically means it's 24-hour cycle that it follows through every single day. Cortisol levels fluctuate predictably over a 24-hour cycle where it will peak in the early mornings, typically around 6 to 8 a.m., which is thought to help provide energy to kind of get you through that first part of the day and also wake you up to go find food. This peak then gradually will decline throughout the day, reaching its lowest levels during late evenings and roughly around the time that you go to bed. This makes some sense because cortisol is a wake-up hormone, so we want it to be higher in the morning and lower in the evening. We get ourselves really into problems when we start making either too much or realistically too little cortisol, as shown here in these two graphs on the left and on the right. People are really much more likely, though, to have too much cortisol. So that's really what I'm going to focus on for the rest of this presentation. Once again, I don't want you guys to think that cortisol or the general stress response is a bad thing. It's not. We need cortisol to live. Without it, we would die. The problem is that our body's stress response system was built to deal with acute things, acute stress, not issues that go on every day, consistently, essentially for the rest of our lives. And that's exactly what we have in the modern world. And this is what really can create a problem where cortisol's normally helpful functions become a problem, as you can hopefully see in the image that I've been sharing. So I just want to walk you through the specifics of a few different organ systems. To be clear, cortisol affects nearly every single tissue and organ system in the body. So really it's just for time reasons that I'm going to only focus on a few different topics. The first is muscle tissue. Cortisol has what's called a catabolic effect, which means that it breaks down muscle protein. The body does this because it's basically trying to break down amino acids, which are those little Lego blocks that make up our muscle protein. And then once in the bloodstream, those amino acids can be converted into glucose, which then gets used as energy, both for muscles in the body, but also for energy to the brain as well. So in short-term effects, acute increases in cortisol can enhance muscle recovery and energy by freeing up amino acids, removing damaged proteins, and regulating glucose availability. But long-term excessive cortisol production, such in situations of chronic stress, can lead to muscle atrophy, weakness, and ultimately reduced muscle mass, as well as elevated blood glucose due to the production of glucose, not necessarily the consumption of glucose. The next topic that I want to talk about is the immune system. Cortisol is an immunosuppressant, and its levels play a crucial role in balancing immune system activity. Short-term effects of cortisol help to regulate and reduce inflammation by inhibiting excessive production of pro-inflammatory cytokines, or proteins that travel throughout your body, recruiting and activating immune cells. And this is really important because the body's immediate response to injury or infection can be rather profound. And so there needs to be some brakes on that system such that it doesn't get out of control. However, in long term, where we have too much cortisol being produced for too long, this really can weaken our immune system overall, leading to increased susceptibility to infections and reduced immune surveillance. Moving on, I want to talk about gut biology next, another topic that we care about here at the Inside Scoop. Cortisol impacts the gut in several ways, particularly through its interactions with what we call the enteric nervous system, which is basically all of the nerves that innervate the gut, along with the vagus nerve, which runs from the brain down to the GI tract. So cortisol has been shown to regulate gut motility, specifically speeding it up in moments of acute stress, while also causing it to slow down in situations of chronic stress, which can ultimately lead to things like constipation. Additionally, cortisol has been shown to increase permeability of the gut. That's not something that we want. We generally want to keep all the things that are inside of our gastrointestinal tract separate from the rest of the body, so we don't want those coming across the gut barrier. And too much cortisol can absolutely make that happen. And then lastly, I just have to note that cortisol has also been shown to alter the balance of the gut microbiota, those 100 trillion bacteria that live inside of our gut. And this can cause a reduction in the diversity of the bacteria in that compartment of our body. And that is ultimately a very negative thing for our gut health. And then lastly, I just really want to focus on the brain for a second, where the impacts of cortisol are pretty profound, specifically in regions like the hippocampus, the amygdala, and the prefrontal cortex. The hippocampus, which is involved in memory and learning, is very sensitive to cortisol. Acute stress can enhance memory consolidation, but chronic cortisol exposure seems to actually impair hippocampal function, leading to memory loss, difficulty in learning, and even atrophy of that part of the brain, meaning death of those cells. Additionally, cortisol has pretty strong impacts on the amygdala, which is responsible for emotional regulation, specifically for fear and anxiety. And so these parts of the brain become overstimulated in the presence of cortisol, which evolutionarily makes some sense. If you're in a stressful situation, you want that part of your brain to be turned on. But once again, with chronic production of cortisol, this can actually start to be some sort of like almost like a permanent change, where your amygdala is way too active, way too often, and you view things that shouldn't be alarming or fear-inducing as actually driving that exact response. Specific to cognitive function, which is driven by the prefrontal cortex, and ultimately is responsible for sort of like executive functions like decision-making and impulse control. We know that those can be impaired by chronically elevated levels of cortisol, and this can lead to difficulties in concentration, problem solving, and controlling impulsive behavior. So what's really scary, as I sort of mentioned, is that we're not really sure if these changes that occur with excessive cortisol are reversible or not. So that's why it's really critical that we think about ways to manage the production of cortisol actively throughout the day. Some of the ways we think we can modulate cortisol is through ultimately things that are going to remove stress or reduce that stress response, like meditation, breathing work, and something called mindfulness therapy. At first, this idea might sound a bit hokey, but this review here, which came out right at the end of 2023, does a great job of summarizing all of the studies that have carefully looked at this question, removing the bad ones that were not done appropriately and just focusing on the ones that have the appropriate controls in place. In this publication, various studies were classified into the form of cortisol modifying behavior that was used in each study. And you can see that here in this graph with the name of the publication on the left and then the type of behavior modification there on the right. While there's no pretty graph to show you exactly which study or types of approaches modified cortisol the most, what I can tell you from reading the publication was that mindfulness and meditation were the most effective at reducing cortisol levels, outperforming things like mind-body therapies, talking therapies, and more religious-based approaches. So most of you probably have a pretty good idea of what meditation entails, although sometimes people overcomplicate things. If you've never tried something like the Calm app, which has simple 10-minute guided meditations, I absolutely for sure would check it out. It's 100% worth the small monthly fee that they charge for you guys. And no, I'm not sponsored. But I'm also a fan of what's called PMR meditation, which basically walks you through a step-by-step process to relax each muscle through basically a contract relax approach. And I'll drop my favorite one down below into the text that accompanies this to a simple YouTube video, which is 100% free. Most of you have probably not necessarily heard of mindfulness therapy before though, which is a bit of an ambiguous term that is a little bit more difficult to understand. Mindfulness therapy is a psychological intervention that involves teaching individuals to focus on the present moment. It's based on several principles which are basically drawn from Buddhist meditation practices, but have been adapted for non-religious or secular use in our modern world. Mindfulness therapy basically aims to help individuals become more aware of their thoughts, feelings, body sensations, and environment without becoming, overwhelmed or reactive to them. The key sort of like core components are, like I just said, present moment awareness, which is basically trying to teach individuals to anchor their attention to the present moment, usually by focusing on the breath or other sensory experiences. This next component is non-judgmental observation, where you basically are trying to observe thoughts and feelings without labeling them as good or bad. Next would be acceptance, where we basically say, hey, this is happening in the present, regardless of whether or not it's a difficult emotion, physical pain, or a stressful situation. We just kind of are accepting that this is happening. And then lastly is increased self-awareness. The goal ultimately through mindfulness practice is to gain a deeper understanding of a person's mental and emotional patterns. So identifying what things start to trigger you and stress you out, and then changing your response to them slowly over time. There are several different approaches that I'll put up on the screen here that are widely used in clinical settings where people are actually going through this with the help of a doctor or a medical-based team. So those are just some approaches that if you want to look and learn more about them, definitely check them out, Google them, and see which one feels like the right one for you. At the end of the day, there really is no single right approach to mindfulness, in my opinion, as someone who has done a couple of those things. You just got to kind of explore what works best for you. Anyway, I hope this video taught you a bit about the stress hormone cortisol, why you should care about its levels in your body, and how to take 10 to 15 minutes a day to actively manage it through basic, simple meditation and mindful practices.